Okay, so now we're ready to drive the demand curves, and that's what this video is going to cover. In the principles of microeconomics, we introduce the demand curve, and what we do is we usually talk about like um, generating some data to give us a demand schedule, and then we take that data and we sort of say like, well, where did it come from? Well, we ask the consumer at different prices of if the price of shrimp is $2 a pound, how many pounds would you buy? If the price of shrimp is $10 a pound, how many pounds would you want to buy? And we think of like interrogating the consumer, asking them some questions, getting their responses, putting them in a table form, or we call it a demand schedule, and then graphing that, and then say, okay, here's the demand curve, because we're getting these changes in quantities that the person wants to buy as the price of the good changes, and holding everything else constant. Now, it turns out we can use the budget line indifference curve utility maximization model to see where this would come from. So what I've done here is I've got the budget line and indifference curve diagram already drawn out. I have three different budget lines in here. Call them BL1, BL2, and BL3. They're all anchored up here on the y-axis, and so they're pivoting, so we know that this is a change in the price of x. These are three different prices of x. So there'd be a price of x that's associated with this budget line, a price of x that's associated with this budget line, and a price of x associated with this budget line. I've drawn in indifference curves already, U1, U2, and U3. We have points of tangency between these indifference curves and the three different budget lines, BL1, BL2, BL3. So these are the different points at which this consumer is maximizing utility at different prices of x as the price of x changes, holding the price of y and income constant. For each of these tangency points or utility maximizing points, then we have a quantity. We have the quantity of x depicted down here on the axis, on the x grid axis. So we have three different quantities of x, and we want to use this to get us the demand curve. Now, the demand curve, it has the price of x on the vertical axis and the quantity of x on the horizontal axis. So that causes us a bit of a problem here. We cannot draw the demand curve here on the budget line indifference curve diagram. The variables on the axis are the quantities of good x and quantities of good y. The price of x is not on either one of these axes, so we can't draw a demand curve on this on this axis. We're going to have to draw a second. We're going to have to draw the diagram over here. But the information we need to draw the demand curve is here on this diagram. Because suppose we want to write out that demand schedule. And usually I like to write this vertical, but here I'm going to have to write it horizontal. The price of x, we have a price of x that's associated with this budget line, and we'll call that PX1. And with PX1, with the budget line BL1, we've got the quantity of x. The quantity of x is x1. That's the quantity that maximizes utility when the person faces the price of x of PX1. It's reflected here in this budget line. At PX2, the quantity of x, the utility maximizing quantity of x is x2. And then PX3, we have x3. So normally I write a demand schedule vertically, but I have to only have a space on it to put a horizontal there. But this would be the data that we would start with in principles to say we've got a demand schedule here. Now let's graph it. Okay, so that's all we have to do. In one sense, if you wanted to, you could take this axis here, and this axis could be the same as this axis because we have quantities of good x on the horizontal axis of the budget line indifference curve diagram, and that's also going to be on the horizontal axis of the budget of the demand curve diagram. So we could just take these x1s, x2, x3, and literally project them onto this same diagram. The most important thing here is that we get them in the right order. So it's x1, x2, x3. So we come over here, we know it's x1, And then, well, that's only one of the coordinates of each of these points. We have to have the prices in here. So we have 3 prices here. And the key thing in terms of making sure we're actually going to have a curve that looks like the demand curve, the key thing is to remember, well, what's the order in which these prices should go here? Well, since the budget line 2 was in the middle, so I'm going to guess, you can probably guess that PX2 would go here in the middle, and it does. Then the important thing is which goes here. Is this PX1 or is this PX1? Well, BL1 has the highest price of X, right? Because this budget line is pivoted in the most. As you can afford fewer bundles, you can afford a lot less X with BL1 than you could with BL3 if you're buying only X. So it must be the case that the price of X, PX1 has to be the highest price. So when we came over here and go into the graph, we have PX1 and we have PX3 then. PX3's got to be the lowest price. It would be there. And so we know for our demand schedule, we have PX1 and X1, that gives us a point here. PX2 and X2, that gives us a point here. PX3 and X3, that gives us a point here. And then we simply connect these points, just as we would have done back in principles. We connect these points. And that's the demand curve for X. So we introduce this in principles of microeconomics, but now we can sort of see better where it comes from. We can see that it's coming from a utility maximizing choice by the consumer. The consumer is maximizing their utility subject to their budget constraint, and then as the price of X changes, we end up getting a demand curve out of this. And this we like because this is behavior that's coming out of utility maximizing the choices by a consumer. So this is really, this is really, we talk about economics using methodological individualism. We like to build up from decisions. We start here. Here's the most basic thing we see in economics: choices by consumers about what to buy. And then we go to this. We get an individual demand curve. From this, if we want to get a market demand curve, it's simply a matter of summing up the demands of each of the consumers who happen to be in this market. But each consumer would have a demand curve that you'd get from this fashion, and so we end up with a market demand curve that's based on utility maximization by all of the consumers participating in that market. So this is how we think of like methodological individuals. And eventually, when we go, well, we've already sort of seen it in principles when we try to explain equilibrium prices and quantities based on supply and demand. Well, that demand curve is coming out of these types of utility maximizing choices by consumers. So there you have it. That's how we get the demand curve that we've already would have introduced back in principles of micro.